Hey guys, what's up? My name is Kobe Jarrow, and welcome to this week's episode of Sidewalk Docs. For today, September 2nd, 2018, we're going to be talking about how festivals have changed over the last 5 or so years. Not only have the lineups changed, the way the festivals are run, as well as the artists that are playing, have really changed quite a bit. So if we start by looking at EDC in 2007, first thing we notice is that it actually wasn't held in Las Vegas, it was held in Los Angeles at the Coliseum. And look how small the venue and the size of the festival was, both in terms of the show and stage sizes, but also in terms of how many acts actually played. There are very, very few compared to the hundreds of DJs that play today. Here's a picture of EDC in 2017, so you can really notice the size difference and how much bigger the festival's gotten. If we look at the lineup, we see there are a few names that we do recognize, like Above and Beyond and Paul Oakenfold. The lineup is very trance and techno heavy. Also, Cascade, thank goodness you changed your logo because you really needed an upgrade. Many names, though, I don't recognize because many of these DJs must have stopped playing over the last 10 years. Then, if we check out Ultra in 2007, we'll see that most of the DJs on the main stage played techno and trance music, while today many of those DJs play on side stages, most of them don't get to play the main stage. Here, there are again a few names. We see Tiesto, Fede Legrand. If we look at the drum and bass stage, I think it's interesting because I actually do recognize a few of the names, such as Subfocus and Andy C, whereas many of the other stages I recognize very few names. Then if we look at Coachella in 2007, over the course of the Few Festival, there are very few electronic acts. We do see Tiesto, Day 2. I think it's also funny because if we look at the very bottom line of Day 2, we see Justice, and now they're known as maybe one of the pioneers of electronic music and a lot of what we hear today. Very few people have had a career that's long enough to span from 2007 all the way until now in 2018. And I think that just shows how short the lifespan of most artists is, unfortunately. Now let's take a look at EDC Las Vegas in 2012. What's so crazy is that the main genres that were played back in 2012 were big room, trance, progressive house, electro house. There was very little trap or bass music, and while there was a good amount of dubstep, it was more the UK dubstep and not so much the sound that we're used to today. So if we look at the lineup first for day one, we'll see that Hardwell actually had a set at 8:30 p.m. So while he's one of the biggest artists today and he often closes main stages, he had a very early set time. The people who were closing the main stage definitely had more of a progressive house sound like Alesso or big room electro house like Bassjackers. So then on day two, Tiesto played, and what maybe is most shocking is that Steve Aoki closed day two, the main stage, but he closed with the Blue Man Group. It would have been something that you'll never see again, and it's crazy that Steve Aoki was doing something like that back in 2012. What's really interesting about day three is we see this guy Funk Agenda who closed. It's kind of crazy to think that the biggest act of 2012 is someone who no longer makes music. So then, if we look here at Ultra in 2012, we can see that the headliners are pretty diverse with everyone from Skrillex to Carl Cox. So again, we see Tiesto. It's also interesting because if we look at the support acts, many names I don't recognize, and I think that's because most of the artists that were playing back in 2012 don't actually play music anymore or don't tour anymore. When Zed played Ultra 2012, he hadn't even released Clarity yet. It would come out later that year, so he was really, really new to the scene, and it's funny now because he's one of the biggest DJs in the world and even has crossed over into the pop scene. Coachella back in 2012 had only about 10 out of 50 acts per day that were EDM acts, and they mostly played progressive house. There weren't really a lot of experimental artists or artists who were up and coming. They really were the main stage headliners at every other EDM festival. So if you look at day one, you see people like Swedish House Mafia, M83, Madion, and you even see Rehab, although he's really, really small, whereas now he's one of the bigger DJs in the scene. And I also think it's really, really funny because if you look at the very bottom line, you'll see the name Kendrick Lamar. 5 years later, Coachella 2017, Kendrick Lamar is a headliner, and it's so crazy to see him go from the very bottom line to the very top line. I think that's such a huge achievement. You can tell that Swedish House Mafia was still together at this point, not only because they played the festival, but because Sebastian Ingrosso played a set without Axwell. And Axwell and Ingrosso came out of the breakup of Swedish House Mafia, so it's sort of funny to see him on day two doing a solo set. And actually what I think is really crazy is that Porter Robinson and Madion both played in 2012 at completely different days and completely different times, but then in 2017 they played their back-to-back for Shelter. So if we go a couple years into the future to 2014, we can see that a lot has changed at EDC. First of all, there's now 8 main stages instead of 7 main stages, so that means that there's more of an interest in EDM, which I think has ultimately been the trend over the last 5-7 years, but this is a really obvious way to see it. Not only that, the styles of music that were really popular were changing. In 2014, even though genres like progressive house or big room house were still really popular, we're starting to see the rise of a lot of deep house and a lot of trap, especially at the hard stage. At the bass pod stage, which nowadays is a lot of dubstep and trap music, back then was actually a lot of drum and bass. And so I think it's really interesting seeing that change where now drum and bass artists are few and far between, but back then it was really a staple of the festival. What's really interesting, if we look at day one, we see Oliver Heldens, who is a deep house pioneer, played at 7 p.m., a really early time slot, even though he's become one of the genre's most recognized people. So we see Martin Garrix for the first time because he, in 2013, he had just released Animals, so it makes sense that he's playing twice, and on the second day of the festival, entirely closing it. Also, on day 2, we see Tiesto again. On day 3, we see a couple interesting things. So first of all, Dash Berlin closes everything, and I think that's sort of indicative of how much trance still played a role in 2014 in the overall electronic music scene. The hard stages did a really good job of curating trap and bass music that we're maybe more used to today. If we look at day 3, we see that Whatsonaut had an 8:45 p.m. time slot. He's now a really big artist and just released an incredible album. Back then, he was barely known and probably really lucky to even play EDC at all. We also see that Axwell and Ingrosso now are playing together because at this point, Swedish House Mafia had broken up, and so there wasn't a place for Swedish House Mafia, but there was just a place for Axwell and Ingrosso. What's interesting about Ultra Music Festival is over the years, they've become a festival that is much more international. This really shows in the music because they have worldwide stages, and one day even have an Ultra Korea stage that features many Korean artists such as Justin Oh or DJ Koo that maybe wouldn't have had this international stage to play on. So for Ultra 2014, we still see a lot of progressive electro house and big room house, but especially on the worldwide stages, we're seeing more trap and bass music that wasn't previously seen at festivals. If we look at day 1, we see Tiesto's on the main stage. We also see that Martin Garrix's rise to fame really was happening around this time because he's playing the middle of the main stage, which, while it's not a headlining spot, it's still a really coveted time slot. Then on day 3, we see Jack U. This is just kind of sad because Skrillex and Diplo together were super dope, and I bet that show was amazing. We'll probably never ever be able to see Skrillex and Diplo as Jack U again, but hey, a guy can hope, right? Then if we look at Coachella in 2014, we'll see something that's sort of interesting. There are about 15 out of 50 artists who play electronic music. This is slightly up from back in 2012 and shows that EDM is getting more popular. And while many artists were the biggest electronic artists of the time, they were starting to experiment with smaller artists as well. So if we look at day 1, we see of course Martin Garrix, who's in a really high position on the lineup, and Zed at this point too because he released Clarity back at the end of 2012. The other EDM acts are really diverse though. There's everyone from Dylan Francis to Headhunters to GTA, so we can see that Coachella is really trying to expand around this time the types of music that they're playing in the electronic tent. They're not only trying to play one type of music, and they're not only trying to play the biggest headliners of the moment. Finally, let's take a look at 2018. Electronic music has really changed quite a lot since 2012, and it's really apparent in the lineups. You see now that EDC has so much future bass and trap and dubstep and bass music that really wasn't prevalent even 3 or 4 years ago. There's still a lot of house music, but a lot of it is bass house and G house. There's not really very much progressive house or big room house anymore, although Tiesto still did play EDC 2018. Also, there are so many back-to-backs. There's more back-to-backs than anywhere, and especially at the bass pod stage, sometimes it's back-to-back-to-back for like 3 or 4 hours. I think that's a really interesting trend to have more artists play at the same night. I don't always think the sets are as cohesive, but it can be more fun for a fan and maybe a little more spontaneous because you get to see 2 artists at once. If we look back at 2012, Chris Lake had a set at 7 p.m. Now he plays every single day, and actually on the 3rd day of the festival, he closes the whole festival with a back-to-back with Fisher. Tiesto actually plays twice and also plays on day 2. Also, a big change that's happened in 2018 is Porter Robinson is no longer seen on really any lineup, but we do see Virtual Self just about playing every single big festival. Similarly to EDC, Ultra 2018 had a lot of house, but really had very little big room and progressive house, and more focused on trap and bass artists. The attitudes towards trance and techno have definitely changed, and people are less interested in listening to it on the main stage. So again, on day 1, we see Virtual Self. On day 2, we see Tiesto again. The craziest part about Ultra 2018 was the fact that Swedish House Mafia returned and closed down Ultra. That was some of the biggest news in EDM in a really long time, and I really hope that they tour this year a little bit. Coachella 2018 featured more EDM than ever, I think. And they also featured a really diverse range of EDM that not only covers the big headliners again, but covers really every genre from house and techno to future bass and trap music. On day 1, we see big artists like Kygo, as well as very experimental artists like Rez. On day 3, Odessa is one of the big headliners, as well as Illenium and San Holo. As we can see over the years, while a few artists are staples in every single festival, many artists will play at it for a year, but then they'll get lost or they'll stop making music and stop touring, and we really won't see them again. I think the change from house music even 4 years ago to a lot more bass and trap music today is really interesting, and I think that trend will continue, although I think there will also be maybe more rap, even at electronic music festivals. Where do you see festivals in the next 5 years? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you all next weekend. Have a great week, guys.